Okay. Well, looks like it's good to go.
Cool.
Yeah. Cool. So, hey, Trevor.
How's it going?
Good. This is good. We're going to get to chat again about the work. So lots of good questions. We'll start with the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the first question was, can you talk about the connection between sexism, gendered racism, and dehumanization and the impacts, especially within the workplace? If you want, I can start.
Go for it.
Okay. So yeah, definitely when I see this question, I think it's a lot about naming systems of power, because like we do live in complex societies, you know, shaped by many different but kind of interrelated systems of power, right? So, you know, if we're talking about sexism, we're talking about patriarchy, racism, white supremacy, you know, poverty or class divides, we're talking about capitalism, and, you know, racism towards Indigenous people in Canada, it's settler colonialism. Like those are all kind of interrelated systems of power. So like, I guess important to note, like discrimination and dehumanization, they aren't really bugs of that system, but built-in features that kind of reinforce each other mutually. So like example that came to mind when I was thinking about it was, you know, it's to the benefit of the very few extremely wealthy 1% that working class white Canadians, for example, might blame other countries for stealing jobs that have just been outsourced, right? Rather than thinking about the many choices that might be made by, you know, extremely wealthy individuals kind of at the top who decide to outsource that labor to wherever it's cheapest because that benefits them. So racism in that way would help kind of maintain that capitalism, because it's kind of keeping that blame shifted to like the other rather than thinking about the system itself that kind of perpetuates looking for cheap labor everywhere, you know? So that's, that's an example. But within workplaces, I think, you know, we talked a little bit about those compounding effects of like racism and sexism that like women of color might experience in their workplaces. So like, you know, everything that, you know, people experience for being female, plus all these things that folks might experience for, you know, being racialized. So everything from having, you know, your skills underestimated, being reduced to stereotypes, being asked to speak for an entire group, you know, pay discrepancies, feeling undervalued. Like there's so many things. You know, increased risk of sexual harassment, which can lead to people feeling really hypervigilant. Yeah, like the stats are there, the information's there. Like we know that those are kind of existing things. And there's many things that I didn't even name. Like my list is like super long. So in those ways, you can kind of see things kind of compounding, you know, like they're related, and you can't really sometimes separate them. You don't know if it's like, am I experiencing this because I'm racialized or because I'm a woman? And it's like, it can be really hard to pull them apart. Anything you would add? I feel like I went off on a tangent.
No, that was great. You know, the only thing that I think about this, and it's a term that a lot of people find jargony, but it's because they don't necessarily do the work to sit down and ponder what it really means around them. And it's like the intersectionality of a lot of these terms. And I mean, we talk about privilege and intersectionality and around all the time, and so people just sort of push it off in their minds. But really recognizing when we talk about these things that, yeah, as you mentioned, people's experience, lived experience, are so intertwined. But we're also very complicated people in terms of all the things that have actually like impacted our lives, whether they be physical, whether they be social constructs, whether they be lived experience or what have you. And I think we need to do a better job, everyone, of understanding what intersectionality actually means and what it means in our workplace and what it means for other people's lived experience and how they experience the world around them. And in doing so, I mean, it's not just going up and asking someone what their deal is, but it's actually spending the time in exploring things like, what is gendered racism? How does that impact dehumanization? How is that actually informing any of the decisions or the biases, the prejudices that I have in my life? And how is that impacting other people around me? Because and I say this, and it's not in a bad way, but we're always selfish about our thoughts in terms of we center a lot of things around our own experiences, and that's the problem when we actually look at sexism, gender sexism, anything around intersectionality, is that we rob people of their complicated history and identities. And like I have a lot of things going for me. Yes, I'm a male, but male is not my necessarily the number one thing. I have gray hair. I have a lot of things that are going on here. And so it's different things impact me in different ways. And I think that's one of the challenges. My rant is way less eloquent than yours, but I think it's the challenges whenever mention intersectionality in the workplace, you see a lot of people's eyes gloss over, just because it's something that they're hearing, but they don't necessarily understand. And I think that's probably one of the biggest gaps with people understanding truly what gendered sexism is, what sexism is, and how that actually plays out in the workplace.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, there's so many big things we could relate it to. Like a huge one in Canada would be like our current crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? Like that's such a clear intersectional issue where they face violence, not only because they're Indigenous, but because they're women. And yeah, like there's a lot, there's a lot to that, and it doesn't make it easy, but it's worth understanding to like get at, okay, why is this happening? How can we stop these things from happening, sort of thing.
Well, and you know, the other challenge is, and this is probably a thread from our entire conversation that we had on the 22nd, but then also in terms of any of the questions we had today, is that people think about these terms in the most severe form of violence. They think about someone hurling a gross, violent, racial term at someone. They think about someone yelling a homophobic remark or a misogynistic remarks, or like someone pushing someone as a form of violence. And the challenge is, what we really don't recognize as much and allows these systems to exist are all the microaggressions that happen around us and all the subtle unconscious biases that come into play. And those are the ones that are actually really problematic in the workplaces, because they're the ones that we excuse, the ones that we don't see, the ones that are built into systems. Yeah. And so we say, oh, of course there's not sexism here. No one's making crass, gross, inappropriate jokes around the boardroom table. Or of course there's not racism here. We have Carol. And you're like, well, that's not the point. Like, you have to recognize what the culture represents, what it actually looks like in terms of the inclusivity, the safety, the security in terms of our teammates, and so, and our colleagues. And so yeah. I think it's incumbent on people, and we don't necessarily have the time or the forum right now, but it's incumbent on people to do the work to understand more about microaggressions, their own unconscious biases, and how those are actually manifesting in microaggressions that allow these systems to exist.
Completely. I think a big thing would be like that. You've seen the pyramid of sexual violence, and I think they've made it for like multiple things now. And that just goes to show that like the most extreme things at the top, like, you know, femicide and like, you know, genocide, like those are the most extreme versions of hate, right, in our society. But like everything at the bottom that seems so benign is the stuff that upholds all the rest of it, right? So what you're talking about, like, yeah, if you let like, you know, sexist jokes kind of play out at work and you're like, we treat our women well, then it's like, no, like you're allowing for a culture where people are not treated well to like exist. I think that actually really relates to the last question on our list, actually, was about addressing the responsibility of, you know, folks who have more privilege to be the ones educating themselves rather than like kind of demanding that labor from someone else. Do you want to speak to that one a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so this is the challenge, is that so many people, okay, you have your horse blinders off and you're now looking around, you're saying, oh my goodness, I have so much to unlearn, I have so much to learn. Amazing. So it's a really scary place to be, but it's also a really healthy place to be because you're starting on your journey. So that's great. The challenge that so many of us do, and I mean, it's not out of a point of like malice or bad, but like we go to the first person of whatever identity that we're recognizing that we just don't know enough on, and we say like, tell me more, explain what I can do. Oh, explain why this is problematic. And well, like that really could be made like well-intentioned. Those marginalized groups are already dealing with the trauma of actually having to live within oppressive and violent environments, and the trauma in which that you're now recognizing that the system sort of inflicts on them. And now, in addition to having to experience that scenario, they now are being asked to inform all their colleagues about why that hurts and why that's problematic, and then what they need to be doing. And if it's just like one person, like, I mean, that'd be slightly different. But the problem is that burden is not for them to wear in terms of informing their colleagues, their workplace, every single person around them in terms of all the way. It's intellectually exhausting. It's also not the point of allyship. And if we want to be allies and understand, say, we recognize the system is harmful for people and its system is not working as we had hoped it would be, then it's incumbent on me to actually go out and start doing the research and the work in terms of what I can do to actually combat that and make it a better system. And sometimes it will be like, I mean, just going out and just maybe you don't know where to go, fire up Google. It's not that hard, right? There's so much research on this. There's so many podcasts. There's so many like interviews. There's so many resources out there. Open Google. It's not hard. It's probably faster than walking 3 cubicles over and asking someone to tell you about their racialized experience. And so it's not hard, but realistically, and this is where it comes, like the crux comes down, is if I'm speaking in the racialized context or I'm speaking in the gendered context, I'm a cis white male. And I recognize that my role is I need to go out and learn more about what the experiences are like, what the challenges are, what the solutions are, and what my role is. And sometimes that means my role is just shutting the hell up and listening. Sometimes my role is like kicking down a door, and sometimes my role is just learning a lot more. And so all of that's on me, and it's not on anyone else. It's not on anyone else to tell me. It's not on anyone else to have to sort of explain to me, unless that's, you know, I mean, that's the role. I'm watching their YouTube video. Like, and so the challenge is we're very lazy in terms of how we want to do this work. And this work is going to be hard. It's going to take a tremendous amount of social capital. It's going to take a ton of energy. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to take a long time. And we're always really lazy around this, being like, oh my goodness, Black Lives Matter. Like, I'm going to go talk to John. Like, well, it's not John's effing job to explain to you his entire life, his entire lived experience. It is our job to say, oh my gosh, that must be terrible. This system is broken. It's violent. What can I be doing to learn more about it and to challenge my own unconscious biases and prejudice that have been built that has allowed this to happen? And so we have to stop being lazy. We have to step up. It is going to cost us. No one's going to be standing there beside the computer giving us a round of applause as we go through this journey by ourselves. And that's the whole point. And so it's tough. Fire up Google, for heaven's sakes, just fire up Google. It's not hard.
Yeah, I think it is interesting to think about the difference between what you referenced at the very beginning, impact versus intent. Your intent might be really good, but trying to consider the impact that might have on someone who might be okay, no, I don't really want to talk about this. I don't need to speak for an entire group. I don't want to relive all the worst things that have ever happened to me. Cool. But I mean, yeah, we learn a lot in our relationships with other people, of course, but that just doesn't mean that the teaching is owed, right? And I guess that's kind of the difference. I talk with so many of my friends who are queer about their experiences, but it's because we're friends, right? And they're telling me about it because it's a mutual relationship where we mutually support one another with the things we're going through. And it's not hey, stranger at the office, please educate me. There's different contexts, I think, in which we can kind of recognize okay, yeah, you say, what is my role in this, right? What is the power differential in this? What are all the kind of things that I should be thinking about? What is our relationship to begin with, right? Especially asking people personal questions when you don't know them that well can be a little bit, but if it's something that you and your friends talk about frequently, that's great. I think it's also not always the learning that you have to do alone. One of the things that I love so much about our book club is that there's guys learning together, right? But they're all guys, so they're all kind of coming from at least that shared experience to be able to be okay, we're gonna do this learning together. So, yeah. But always good questions. I'm really happy people are asking them and thinking about them. Mm-hmm. The second question that I have on my list here, or I guess it's third now at this point, was how do we respond to people that are in denial about needing to be more aware of sexism in the workplace in our department because, quote, they don't see it?
So I have two lines of thoughts on this. I'm very impatient and very bombastic. And so that side of Trevor would be no patience for that. If the person can't see it, goodbye, right? Step up, be a decent human, being the person that we all need to be and that you want to be, or goodbye, thank you very much, take care. Now that's the bombastic side of Trevor, but in the strategic and pragmatic side, in terms of what this actually looks like in terms of changing cultures and having your culture match the vision and the values of an organization, is they haven't reached a point yet where they're comfortable acknowledging the systems around them. And for some people it takes longer than others. Some people, they have an aha moment right away. Some people it takes a little bit longer. And as peers, as managers of these individuals, there's an opportunity to continue to have people share their experiences. And so this person needs to be listening more. And it's a challenge too, right? Sometimes we do it all the time, but sometimes people are resistant. You are listening to someone tell a story, and in the back of your mind, you're contextualizing it. Well, like that happened because this happened. So like this person needs to calm down, or that happened because of this, or like, oh, if they only did this differently, right? We contextualize it. And so a lot of these people who are really resistant to it are have this sort of counter narrative running in their mind. And the challenge is they just need to hear more. And if you're a manager working with these individuals, you need to provide more opportunities, collision points. And I don't mean that as in a fictionist way, but like collision point is an opportunity for two people to have their experiences and their stories shared. And so I think the people who are the most resistant are the ones who need to continuously hear stories from other people in order to bring them on their journey. If we want actual attitudinal behavioral change, that happens the fastest and the most sustainably on a peer-to-peer level. So instead of it going to a training and being like, oh, like Jonathan had to come through and go through an HR training, he checked all these boxes. It happens by hearing stories of their peers, that another one of their peers, this is what happened to them. The stories that we heard from the ninth floor are very, very meaningful. Continuously provide spaces for things like that to be shared. Having opportunities for their male peers to also share their aha moments, their realization of what the system looked like the moment they removed their blinders, and then them recognizing what role they have to play in terms of changing and evolving themselves and the culture around them. The more they start to hear these things around them, the more things slowly start to melt away in terms of their opposition. It takes time. It's frustrating because, again, I want the change now. But I recognize in terms of like real behavioral attitudinal change, it does require some work. And so it's providing those opportunities for those stories to be shared and heard, and then also recognizing this person just needs to listen. It's not about them reporting back and all that, just actually digesting and reflecting.
Totally. And I think to kind of appeal to folks' logic, I guess, like what I was thinking was kind of similar to what we had chatted about on Tuesday too. Like, if, you know, people have established that sexism and racism and other forms of discrimination are big problems in the world, like we've seen that play out in so many ways, right? From like where they grow up to income levels to quality or availability of education to people's likelihood of being a victim of violence or going to prison. Like there's so many different ways that we see it play out. Our workplaces are just not exceptions to those things, right? Like they don't exist separately from the rest of the world. So if we can kind of, you know, if folks aren't seeing it, then I just feel like they're just not looking for it at that point. And I do think it's good when we do things like we did on Tuesday, like you said, like having folks come together to hear stories from their own workplace. I just feel like how at that point could anyone really deny that, like, these are true stories that people have shared now, like they're out there. You can't really say that they didn't happen, right? Like that,
yeah.
You know, so, but yeah, I also, I'm curious about kind of flipping things, because sometimes it feels like, you know, especially women or people of color are being asked to prove that discrimination exists, but I'd be really curious for folks who don't see it, can they prove that it doesn't exist? Like,
great point.
You know, honestly, undertaking work like this uncovers it so quick, like uncovers it very quickly, right? Like, you know, we heard those stories. There's, like, you literally ask and you will know, like you will be able to tell right away that it's a problem. And, you know, if folks were watching too, like they saw their colleagues replying in the chat about those stories being relatable, about the questions being things that they were thinking about. So like, it's out there, it's a problem in your workplace.
Yeah. You know what the other thing is? People also need to recognize what is problematic too. Because you mean so many workplaces I go into and people be like, oh, well, that's just the way it is. It's just the cost of doing business. People of all genders, and being like, well, like I had to do that, and that's what it is. Or like, oh, being like, oh, that's like a male saying like, oh, that's not so bad. Like that, like began the intent versus impact piece. And it's time for like individuals to pump the brakes, hit pause, and actually go back and actually look at what those things do to these cultures in the organization. That yes, maybe. I mean, if you have an old view of this, like maybe, yes, you're not putting your hand on someone's like back or like bottom or something like that. And you're like, okay, well, like this is a safe place to work because we're not doing that to our individuals. And so it's like, okay, well, how about emotional, intellectual safety? Because those things matter. And like, what is the environment in terms of how you're saying things, or like, are you talking over people, or are you doing other things? Because those are also forms of sexism and levels of harassment in the workplace as well. And so just because you're not physically touching someone or physically harassing someone does not all of a sudden mean that you have a safe workplace. And so it's important for people to peel it back and say, just because one thing doesn't exist, you look around and be like, oh, I mean, we're not physically harassing our people here, that all of a sudden, like, there's no harassment. Yes, there is. And it's not unique to one company. It's not unique to one region. This is something that happens everywhere. As you mentioned, we have the numbers. We know it's a thing. So it's incumbent on people to hit the brakes and say, like, why am I so opposed to recognizing that this is actually happening around me?
Right.
And I think that's the deeper question that people need to think about, is like, what do I have to gain or lose by my significant opposition to the fact that this is even a challenge that my colleagues and my organization are dealing with? Why am I so obstructionist on just the very notion that this could be happening to my colleagues? Because if the answer is anything other than like, oh, I didn't know, you are a significant challenge in terms of moving towards a more safe and secure workplace. And that requires a lot of other work and a lot of like self-assessment and reflection. But I think that's the big question. If you don't see it, you need to step back and actually analyze why you're not seeing it.
Totally. And yeah, such an interesting thing you mentioned too, that made me think, like, sometimes people have a view of like, because, you know, getting into this field was hard, or getting my degree was hard, or working here has been hard, it should be hard for other people. Like, I had to go through this, now so do you. Like, such a strange mindset to me, because I'm like, if you recognize that it was not good for you, why wouldn't you want it to be better for the next person? You know, like, not a shitty experience. Like, that has always been a confusing mindset to me. But okay, next one. We did chat about this one, so I feel like we can kind of get it, just go over it a little quickly. But as women, there's a lot of career advice floating around that encourage us to behave in a different way in order to be respected and promoted, suggesting we need to communicate differently, present differently, etc. I'm a white woman and understand this is probably even more common for racialized women at work. To me, this says a lot about how much further we need to go to achieve equity. You can't bring your whole self to your work if you have to be someone else to be successful. How can allies with good intent have better impact than giving this sort of advice? And I have a little, like, a short thing kind of that I was thinking about. Basically, I think, like, again, a sort of flipping of mindset, like, assume it's not them and just assume there's no changes that they need to make. Like, assume that there are things we need to look toward fixing in our workplaces instead. So there's a book, Michelle King wrote a book called The Fix, and the tagline is "Fix workplaces, not women." Very much, like, says it all. Instead of thinking, like, what could she do differently as an individual, just asking ourselves instead, what barriers existed for her? What can we do to remove those barriers? And then, like, let's work on those things. That's kind of my answer to that.
Yeah, you know what? I've been thinking a lot about this one, because when you go into organizations around the globe, it's not just Canada, it's not just North America, but around the globe, and they have these systems, and you see different women's at different levels of the organization, and you talk to them in terms of like how your experience is and yada, yada, yada. And one of the groups of opposition that we get sometimes when you go into workplaces and say, okay, we're going to do this gender transformative programming, we actually get some opposition from the women being like, I've spent 20 years trying to be a bro, don't rock the boat. And I spent 20 years switching who I am and camouflaging and playing this role so I could advance, I could feel included, I could participate in a way that allowed me to participate by playing someone who's not them, not their authentic selves, and sort of like trying to chameleon into what some of the workplace decided was the identity they wanted, which is male centric. And so that's always been a really rattling thing for me. And it's so many different industries. It's the same feedback as being like, this is really important, we want to do it, but please, like, don't mess things up. And that to me is so sad, because it means these people have spent an entire career having to completely build a mask in terms of who they are, how they operate, how they communicate, just to engage and be successful in a workplace for someone else. That's messed up. And so what we need to think, with that in the back of my mind, is always a lesson in terms of being like, how are we actually challenging these structures, and what does inclusion and success actually look like in a workplace? And it's not just about saying, okay, great, we have some women in senior leadership roles, or like, great, you have a quota of like, we're going to have 30% by X year. Great, but like, what does diversity actually mean in that? Like, do you have diversity of age, of lived experience? Do you have diversity of places for people that have lived in different regions, different educational backgrounds, like all these different factors in terms of like different diversity that actually allows people to be who themselves and celebrate and actually create the more successful teams. And so like the career advice that always goes around in terms of like dress the part, don't do this, talk like this, all that stuff, I think is, to be perfectly honest, bullshit. Because essentially what it is trying to do is try to mold different genders into the idea of what it is to be this gender normative male identity of what it means to be successful in a business world. And then it punishes them or punishes anyone else who doesn't actually subscribe to that. And that's problematic. So like it could work for some individuals, but it's absolutely problematic for the workplace. It is devastating in terms of business outcomes. So if people want to just like look at it from a business side, that actually, it's not even just that there's an opportunity cost that you're actually not even getting to where you want to go. It is actually devastating for actually the performance of your business. We know that. Like I could follow up with the multiple studies from like PwC and all that stuff. And so like we need to flip this around in terms of being like, hey, like Cheryl, here's how you could be successful in our company. Here's 2 or 3 things you could do, instead of it being like, here's how you can be successful in your career. Like, here's things you want to focus on. Here's what things like I want to challenge you. Like the good career advice, the good mentoring and championing advice that we want. The career advice always floats back into what you need to do to play along. And we need to flip that on its head. And that requires leadership to recognize that that is problematic and actually invest energy and time into what inclusion and equity actually means at a workplace. So we move past this like dress to impress,
Or like status
like
quo. Yeah.
Like that's bullshit.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you. I feel like we had a similar line, but yeah, we both said similar things, but diverge a little bit, and I think it's good.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. The this one kind of comes back to a little bit what we were saying earlier about like it not being, you know, folks who are oppressed, it's not their job to educate folks with more privilege, but I'll let you respond to this one. So I think it's admirable that Trevor is encouraging people to be open to listening to people who call out problematic behavior and to have difficult conversations. But calling out this kind of behavior is often dangerous, especially for Black, Indigenous, or people of color, especially women. How can you recommend growth in this issue without people putting themselves and their professional careers at risk, and putting the onus on calling out this behavior on the person who's facing that discrimination?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is, it's not always safe. And I'm not even saying like physically safe. It could be from a social standpoint or what have you, in terms of actually calling out said behavior, specifically to the person doing it. And also, to be perfectly honest, like you may not have the energy, you may not have the emotional like capacity, and it also shouldn't be your responsibility. And so I absolutely respect that. And I think there's a difference between when I was in the session referencing that in terms of being like, if I say something, actually we've had this conversation before, like, and I've used like gendered language when I say like, later guys, or how you guys doing? And like, that's something I'm trying to change in my language. So like, if you and that said like, hey, you said guys, that'd be like, oh my gosh, thank you. Like I am trying to, like, that is helpful for me. Like that matters to me in my language. So I would accept that. If someone was doing something in a more aggressive way, and maybe that wouldn't be a well-received thing because they're feeling targeted, attacked, and they're feeling shamed and defensive about it. I totally respect that. But here's where it actually matters for more people at the organization. As if we're in the scenario of, as let's say a BIPOC woman, where are all the other guys around the table? Where are all the other guys in the office? So I may not be acting violently in the office, or I may not be like sexist in the office in terms of what I'm doing and saying. Then why am I not stepping up and being a better ally in that situation? Because I'm sitting around the boardroom table and I'm hearing that. Instead of just like shuffling the papers, it could be like time out. I could go and talk to the person afterwards and say like, I don't know if you realize what you said in that meeting, but this is how it came across. This is how it meant to other people. I know that you don't want this. That's not what your intended impact was in terms of the harm it caused for someone else, and then the perception that now other people have of you. I want to let you know so you can go and do X, Y, Z coming out of it. There's a way to position that's strength-based, but it should be on all the other allies. If I hear something that happens in terms of problematic behavior, I should not be calling it out. I should be going to the person who is impacted by that and be like, I hear you, I see you. What can I do to support? Like, do you need me to file with you? Do you want to just like explain your, like just download and vent to me? Whatever it is. Our allyship needs to be incredibly more active, and it needs to come from all the other people. And this is the coming out of the session. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is if we can activate all of the other men within the organization, all of the other men within CBC and with the teams who consider themselves to be allies, consider themselves to be positive influences on the space, if they recognize now their role in terms of seeing things that may feel off, that are sexist or violent or harassing or inappropriate in whatever way, if they're seeing that, they have a flippin' job to do something about it. And it is inexcusable for them to be silent, for them to just to shrug it off, that they need to step up and challenge that individual. They need to step up and challenge the system and the culture and the community that's allowing that to operate. Otherwise, they're complicit. And they no longer can say that they don't recognize anymore because we spent several hours going through what it is. And they no longer can say like, oh, I wasn't aware. Well, then your ignorance is the challenge here. And I know that's really strong language because I really want to be strength-based in terms of like, we do have a role to play. There's like really good things we can do, but we need to be activated. And it's not on women. It is not on women of color. It is not on other affected parties who have to experience this type of harassment or sexism or whatever we're talking about at the work. It is not on them to find a solution to the marginalization, their oppression, and the trauma that they're experiencing. It is on the rest of us to step up and do our goddamn jobs.
Yep. I'm like, I don't think I have anything else to add to the mic drop that I just heard. I mean, yeah, honestly, there are folks who do the educating of others, like we were talking about earlier, as their jobs as well, right? And that's different. Like someone is putting it out there to get paid to do that work, right? You know, I know like quite a few folks are like activists and educators who have like Patreons, you know? So like if you're benefiting from learning from someone, you can also pay them for that work too. Like it doesn't have to be just like a, you know, total loss for one person and just a gain for you. Like you can make that more of a mutual thing by paying for the work, like paying for the education. You know, that's what we do with school. Like, well, I don't know why we wouldn't do it otherwise, right? So yeah, supporting that ongoing work. I also just, I don't know, I love encouraging people to get involved in like grassroots ways to kind of take this outside of the office too, because I feel like the more you learn outside of work too, the more you're like, oh cool, how does this apply to my workplace? How does this apply in these scenarios? And you know, there's so much good that we have potential to do, and there's so much need for that work. So anyway,
can I just circle back, because I did leave on a pretty fired up charge note, but I think
sure.
what I would say is like, well, it was very much like it's time for us to step up and do the right thing and do what's required, particularly men on this specific notion. Again, I'm not negatively attacking or targeting. Like, I'm male. Like, what I'm saying is like, I recognize that I have a role to play in creating the culture and the living the values that I know are up here, or I know is what CBC's value structure is. And so I recognize that it's not up to other people. I am part of the system, and so I have a role to play in that. And I have a positive role to play in it. It's not about like kicking down the door with a flame torch and be like, let's do this. It's about like saying like, I have something, like I can engage, I can see something, I can support, I can unlearn, I can help someone unlearn and learn as well. And like, we can have these like productive, healthy conversations with someone else. It doesn't need to be a fist fight every day in this work. There's a positive way for us to talk about it. And so while I was very charged in terms of like, step up and do your goddamn job, which I fully believe in, it also means that like, there is a healthy, positive, shame-free way based forward that we can actually actively contribute and change the culture as well.
Totally. And yeah, it is really cool to watch folks kind of go through that change too. I have a good friend who would have never, ever called himself a feminist probably like 3 years ago, who 2 years ago did the Walk a Mile in Her Shoes fundraiser for the YWCA in the city, because he was like, yep, that violence against women is still a problem, and I do have a role to play, and I do want to be part of the solution. And I'm super proud to see that growth. And I mean, it obviously took time, and it took people, me mostly, calling him out and being like, hey, let's talk about it. But like, again, it's appealing to people's values, saying like, hey, I know you don't believe that, right? Like, I know you don't believe what you just said, or why are you laughing at that dude's joke, right? Like, talking with them later, telling them, you know, this is how it kind of affects me. All of that is good stuff to keep doing. So, okay. The next question is about tools that exist to, okay, so what tools may exist to help us as women have those one-on-one difficult conversations with our male colleagues about an instance in which we experience sexism based on an interaction with them, particularly colleagues in senior roles? I think this is a really good question.
Yeah, so that's super important. So I think there's a few things there. So if, first of all, it's not necessarily on you. Like if you feel more comfortable going through HR or through other channels within the organization, those are safe. And again, that's not from a reporting side. It's not just, if you want to report that, that's great, and that's fine. But HR is not just for reporting. HR can actually help you plan out these type of conversations in a healthy way as well. So it's not just on you to like listen to us rant on Zoom about these difficult conversations. You do have internal resources that your confidentiality is protected, and they will help you navigate these scenarios. And some of those were outlined in the presentation, and Ratsumi also has all of those as well, that she can connect you with. In terms of having this conversation with someone, and this is always challenging because a lot of people do get really defensive, and the defensiveness is not necessarily because of like forget you, I like all that, but it's a lot of it is based around shame for men in terms of being like, have they done something that they didn't recognize they were doing, and how's it impacted, and like what, and so there's shame attached to that, and so that, and shame inspires defensiveness. And so I recognize that. I think there's some difficult conversation frameworks that exist within the CBC's own structure, but also, I mean, we have some that we can also share as well, if that helps, that specifically help frame up some of these conversations in terms of raising it in a productive and safe way. In terms of saying like, I don't, depending what it is, but like, I sort of want to just reference in the last question, right? Like there's a way to say like, I don't know if you realize what just happened there, and like, just want to like, let you recognize what the impact of what you said was. I understand that may not have been your intent, but like, this is how it felt, and this is how things came across. Not as a, like a, how dare you, but a more just being like, I'm trying to help you understand the impact here. Yeah. And I think that's always really helpful. I think it's also sometimes if you sort of structure the conversation in a way that is strength-based, that you're challenging the behavior, not the person, you're less likely to get defensiveness out of that. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong in terms of like, I'm just saying in a real pragmatic, actionable way, that these are safe ways to sort of do it that actually reduce any of the harm that you may experience towards yourself. And so, I think that was something sexist you said, not saying you're being sexist, as an example, in terms of just reframing the question, that allows someone to be called in instead of called out. And you're more likely to see attitudinal behavioral change with that type of way of addressing it. But again, without knowing the specific individual, I would encourage you to actually visit HR and use those resources. They're helpful on this. We always think about just a visit to HR as like putting in a report and getting someone in trouble. That's not the case. They can actually help role play and build out a structure in terms of what actually makes sense for this. And sometimes role playing is something that would actually help, because it is a difficult conversation, and just practicing it, verbalizing it, and playing that out actually is significantly helpful.
Totally. I definitely agree. And even just like beyond, it's like thinking about who can help you is such a good thing to do, whether it's like your colleague or your therapist. Like I've done that in the past where I'm like, ooh, I need to prep for like a really tough conversation. So I chat with my therapist about it, because who better to help me than someone who helps people deal with like tough stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And yeah, I went to a really impactful seminar, oh gosh, it was like last year, but stuff still sticks in my head from this one. It was with an anti-racism educator from Canada named Rania, and she's on Instagram as Rania Writes, I believe. And like a lot of what she talked about is like approaching with a lot of empathy, and like there are a lot of those tools, like we mentioned earlier, the golden bridge, like giving people that kind way to kind of backpedal if they know they said something that's like not good. So quick example, I promise. I was at a birthday party a short while ago, an outdoor, distanced of course, but someone said something really harmful about homeless individuals, and basically was saying like, I don't understand why the city that I lived in would pay for them to be in hotels when like other people are struggling, just sort of like, basically this like they don't deserve basic human dignity kind of like conversation. And I was like, oh my God, the golden bridge that I thought of was just like, yeah, won't it be so much better when folks can be in permanent housing rather than hotels? That's so temporary, right? Just purposely kind of misunderstanding what they're saying to kind of offer them an out. Like, instead of saying like straight up, I'm interpreting that you are like hostile towards, you know, folks who are homeless and don't think they deserve dignity and, you know, life. I'm going to offer this golden bridge and say like, yeah, would it be so much better when it can be permanent, when we can fully support people? Like, so offering people like, you know, outs like that to help them reframe with like that, in that way, I hope, you know, she didn't feel attacked. I was offering her an out, right? So, and if she doubles down, well, then that's a different conversation, right? But if she takes that bridge and she's like, oh yeah, I kind of think what I said wasn't great. Like, yeah, of course I believe people like deserve dignity. You know, you're getting it on a different track. So
no, that's a great point.
Yeah. I think there's also like the tools of nonviolent communication, which folks can look up. Those are really interesting. It actually echoes what you were just saying, Trevor, about like what you observed, what you felt, what you need, and then your request for people, like what you want to see change. So there's actually like that tool is also pretty important, I would say. But yeah, at the risk of running too long, should we do one more question or no?
Let's do another question, and then because we're going long, I don't want people to feel like they have to dedicate a whole afternoon just to our Q&As.
Fair enough. Okay, I think this is interesting. So we always tend to think about women being victims of sexism. I was wondering if there could be, or there were instances where men felt discriminated against. I'm trying to look from the opposite side of the table too, and know that women need to be cognizant, or sorry, know what women need to be cognizant of while working with men. I really love this question.
There absolutely are situations and instances where men feel discriminated against, and or feel experience discomfort or what have you. I would say two things on this. One, our first reaction in terms of when we hear a session talking about like sexism in the workplace, talking about gender sexism in the workplace, shouldn't be like, well, why is it like, why are we like men being targeted, or why, like, and I don't think they're being targeted. I think we're just having an honest conversation about how we change the structures and systems around us. And it's the same thing of being like, well, where's our straight pride? Or where's like White History Month, or where all of these things? Recognize why we're having the conversations and these things actually exist in their forums. And I think that's the first point on that, is saying, we know from the numbers that this is a gendered challenge. And it's, yes, people of all genders and experiences experience this level of harassment or discrimination or discomfort. But when we're talking about like the sheer numbers of this, it is very clear that the sexism and the systems, the patriarchal systems in terms of our workplace that are based, are actually like are set in one specific way and going one direction. And I listen, as a male, I recognize that, and I'm not coming in as like this like super hippie thing. Like I'm a business focused, like minded person, and I recognize the systems that we are operating in as a male are designed for men and are violent in different ways towards people of other genders. And again, expect people to recognize that violence is not, well, I'm not talking about like someone being punched in the face. I'm talking about like different forms of discrimination and harassment and things like that. And so this is the sort of the point earlier, that when people are hearing these stories, they a lot of the time they try to build a context in their mind where you hear the story, you're trying to be like, well, like maybe they were like really like coming across too strong. Or like, oh, well, like the manager was having a bad day, or like, oh, well, like all these like different like contexts that we put in and around it in terms of trying to find the other half. There's not always like an equal other half in terms of situations, right? In terms of like harassment or like these engagements go in the workplace. And so I think there is bias that go all around. Yes, there are instances, but we need to recognize the numbers. We need to recognize the system. And if we're not doing that, and instead we're saying, well, like, I know like Tim experienced a level of discrimination, therefore like we and using that as a tool to invalidate the sheer number of and the systems around us, take a moment, sit back and think about why you feel the need to do that. and why that is the avenue that you're going, instead of saying like, that was really shitty for Tim. Absolutely. But what I'm hearing is there's a lot of shitty situations for other people around me, and I need to sit and listen and understand why that's happening. So I think it's more incumbent on the individual who I guess wanting to understand the whole scene, wanting to get that. I understand it, but think a little bit deeper down in terms of why we feel the need to contextualize, over contextualize with something that's not there. And obviously we always want context and understanding, but like, we know the numbers.
Right. Totally. I like that answer. I would also add, I think it's so interesting to look at the ways in which patriarchy harms men as well, because like we live in this system that largely, you know, if men can conform to this like patriarchal ideal that we put out there, then they can benefit. So many men are not going to be able to conform to that ideal. Like, you know, it's not the same for a man who's racialized, for a man who's disabled, for a man like, you know, who have different, like these different experiences, you know, men who lives in poverty. Like we have set the pinnacle of like masculinity as being like this Don Draper, like fictional character that basically like no one can live up to. Plus, as soon as you age, you're not that guy anymore. As soon as, you know, there's always going to be things that happen that, that decrease your ability to like fit that mold, right? So even if you could ever achieve it, you're not going to maintain that forever, right? So there's, and yeah, like talking about that, the difference, because it's fascinating to see the parallels. There's parallels, right? We talked about men being put into a box, right? They're put into this narrow confines of masculinity. Women are put in double binds all the time. Like the difference is that if men can achieve it, like if they can, then they still benefit, right? And they benefit in multiple ways from patriarchy still. Like women, we're put in double binds where no matter what you do, it doesn't matter. Like you're not, it's not going to be okay, right? Like like most obvious examples are like when it comes to like how it's so great for like men to have like multiple sexual partners, and that's kind of like revered and seen as like, oh yeah, great, he's a man. But if women do the same, right, we're penalized, we're slut shamed, like that exists, you know. But on the flip side, it's a double bind, because if you don't do that, you're still penalized, right? If you don't have multiple partners or whatever, you're still penalized. So there's no winning on that side. So it's very interesting though, because we can totally see that there's parallels, like, you know, patriarchy and kind of these gender expectations suck for everybody. So, you know, I always hope that men don't even see this as allyship, and they actually see that they're stakeholders in changing a system that has hurt them as well and continues to hurt them. So yeah, I think that's a really cool conversation. And if folks are interested, like our Next Gen Men's Circle events that we do every month are open to people of any gender to come and listen. And our, you know, our conversation is always focused on masculinity and how it interacts with different things. So yeah, you can hear all about the ways in which, like, you know, and not just hear, but discuss with others the ways that masculinity is really limiting to men. So we could make that the last question. We did say that we wanted to talk about this, like women showing bias towards women though. So we'll do that.
Yeah, let's close out on that one. That's a good one.
Sure. So yeah, this question is, how do we handle situations when women show bias towards other women? Because according to her experience, she feels that all other women are facing the same issues and do not provide them with opportunities or challenges that other women like to pursue. Question is not limited to just women to women bias, but perhaps for other genders or sexes as well. This is a great question. And we talked about this a little bit before we started recording too, because we're like, ooh, good one. And honestly, like, yes, there are so many instances where like women police other women's behavior, because we all exist within patriarchy and we all want to, like, you know, advance at least like our own position potentially, right? Like looking out for number one. And that can totally mean like women participating in like slut shaming other women, or women participating in like, you know, fat phobia, and like in, upholding like, you know, thin privilege and white privilege in terms of white beauty standards, and like there's all sorts of ways. And I don't know, I guess to me, I think of like kind of using the same sort of tools that I use when talking with anyone about those tough conversations, those things that we mentioned before, you know, tools for nonviolent communication, you know, offering people those golden bridges and different things like that, calling them to a higher standard. I think largely, again, depending on the relationship you have with them. And, you know, it's still possible that this person has more power over you if they're like in a leadership position and you're not. So I think a lot of those same tools still apply. at least in my experience. But you know, if you're a woman trying to call out another woman for something, you hope that you have that common experience of like existing as a woman in the world that you can kind of call back to, like, hey, you know, like the thing you said earlier, it was kind of slut shamey. Have you not like kind of been on the receiving end of that too? Like it's sort of harkening back to like common experiences. Not that you would necessarily say it that way, but I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think about this a bit, and it sort of goes back to some of the programming and the structures and people sort of like playing into a structure, right? And so because the system has been set against women in different ways, and the system is changing, but in a lot of ways the system is not changing, and or not changing fast enough. And because it's set up in a certain way, I recognize that it almost pits people of different genders against each other in a lot of ways, because I mean, an organization's being like, okay, we're going to have like 2 people out of 10 will be of a gender. And then you're like, then all of a sudden there's this like lateral competition that happens between people because the system is not actually truly inclusive. It's just pretending to be diverse or trying to highlight different levels of diversity without actually celebrating inclusion. And so I think that's a very real thing. I think the other thing that to add on to this is that there's an intersectional level to it as well. And so, while yes, there are like people who identify as women, they also have other aspects to their identity and their lived experiences that add a lot more nuance and complexity to who they are. And so that also adds to it. This scenario is not getting resolved just by like 2 women talking to each other and being like, hey, like we like truce, like we're like let's build an alliance, like and like do that. Like that's great, maybe for a specific one very specific scenario, but in order to actually solve this challenge, we need the people who hold the social power, the structural power, who are setting the sort of limits and parameters on the system. We need them to actually come in and start to break down and change how things are actually built. Because it is, again, it's not incumbent on, you mean some blood pact between 2 women to say like, this is how we're actually going to navigate the situation in terms of opportunity and stuff like that. Yes, that's great, but that's not a systemic change.
Yeah.
And if we want to create an environment where we're not seeing this lateral competition and lateral like aggression, because we actually have a truly inclusive and equitable environment where people can be successful and feel secure and safe. If we have that environment, this type of stuff starts to fade away. And so one is a shorter term in terms of what I think you're saying in terms of like, here are the specific tools into the conversations and how to frame it and how to work through. Yeah. The bigger one is, this is for the men. This is not just a female, a woman issue. This is incumbent on everybody in the organization to take seriously and recognize that they have a role to play in sort of combating and challenging a system that allows this type of thing to be exists.
Totally.
So.
And definitely like lots of empathy when you recognize that like things like lateral violence exist, right? Because you're like, oh yeah, you're just fighting to try and make it in this environment that wasn't meant for us as well, right? Like I can understand why you know, you might act that way then, or why those things might happen. But yeah, totally, like, you know, women have internalized sexism too, like 100% in so many different ways, and we have our own internal work to do for sure. Can't really ignore that. There is one more that we didn't do. All
right, let's do it really quick, and then we should go off, because now it's going to turn into like a 2-hour session.
I know people are going to be like, "Ugh, so sick of you guys." Okay. Do you think there's an incentive that causes men to act sexist? For example, I'm more likely to get a promotion if I'm willing to participate in locker room behavior. Can men address this without hurting their career, their salary, their respect, etc.? I'm just going to say going against the system will probably cost you something. And it's probably worth it, right? If the end goal is changing systems and you refuse to participate in things that are harming others, right? Quick story from one of Jake's friends I heard. He worked in HR with like all women, and one day he was invited to go golfing with the guys that worked in like a different department in his company. And he said, like, are my colleagues invited as well? i.e. all the women in the HR department. And they were like, no, just you. And he was like, well, I'm not gonna go if my colleagues aren't also invited. And he was never invited out again, but he was passed up for promotions, but he felt like entirely like you know, this isn't the place for me anymore. It cost him something, but his integrity was intact, you know? Like, I think for him, he was like, it's worth it. I needed to stand up for my colleagues. So yeah, I think, no, it will probably cost you something. That's my answer.
So I will say two things in that. So yeah, there is like a locker room culture and behavior in some ways that should be rooted out. Because what we define as locker room culture is misogynistic behavior, and that's not in any way, shape, or form acceptable. That needs to be rooted out and completely solved for. In terms of some of these other like soft things, like the golf is a great example, or like going for drinks after work when that is allowed or whatever, or like playing, like going, yeah, like squash is a big thing in Toronto at lunch and stuff like that. So I don't know, like those type of soft things. And so you're like, okay, like that's great for my career. But like, think about how those are exclusionary to other people. A parent that has to go home right at the end of the day, has a hard stop and has to go home and can't go for that drink, or can't do something, you know what I mean? Like all of these things have like a small material impact on the social side, because a lot of people, when you talk to some men specifically in the hiring areas, and you're like, they go in and be like, oh, like Todd's great for that role, Todd will be good, blah blah blah. And that's just because like he has a closer relationship with Todd, because they've gone and done these locker room moments where they do that. And so, or they've been able to talk like offline about like salary expectations of bands and what that means and yada yada yada. And so what we need to do is I mean, it doesn't mean that we can't have like drinks and stuff like that, but an organization I was working with, instead of having their after drinks, if they had a really, really successful quarter or month or whatever like that, instead of going out for drinks and all that, they did it in the afternoon. And so everyone could participate. And the drinks or whatever like that was completely like open for everyone. And the people who had children could stay and participate in that and didn't have to rush home and miss out. So small things like that, if we start re-gearing what we're willing to do, it doesn't mean I no longer can have a drink with a colleague and I no longer can like shoot the shit and like have that like that the engagement. It just means that opportunity is now open for everyone to participate like freely and openly if they're in that way. And then also finding other things to do that engage more people. So it's not just, oh, the only two things we do is go for drinks and play golf. No, like there's other things that you can be doing to make sure that everyone's engaged and has those opportunities. And you start to see a really big difference on that. I think that, so there's two things on this. One is participate in problematic behavior. No, everyone should be as specifically after this conversation, after going through this training and everything, everyone should recognize that that's problematic and we should be challenging that and rooting it out and changing the culture that allows that to exist. The smaller, softer parts that certain groups are excluded from, and it's not just gender, but it could be based on like sexual orientation, it could be based on a number, age, or what have you. All of those things that we think that are like just like a cool interpersonal moment, but are exclusionary to other people based on whatever, those are the ones that we need to be a little bit more strategic about, saying like, how do we make those more equitable and inclusive? And so that everyone has the opportunity to build those social relationships that do overly favor men in that way because of the way that it's structured right now.
Totally. Yep. And final note, just for the guys out there, again, remember, most of your peers also like get uncomfortable when things are like locker room talk or like it's clearly sexist or clearly misogynist. Like they're also uncomfortable with it. So like one person is like, I'm gonna say something, it's to the benefit of everybody, and more people will start stepping up, especially men, who are recognizing like, oh yeah, I didn't feel good about that. Most men don't want those kinds of environments. So someone kind of breaking free from that, you kind of set the tone for everybody else and set an example. So yeah, integrity over other things. It's tough, but kind of like taking that as like the thing that you need to preserve is like your integrity, your values, those things above maybe, you know, advancement in a system that isn't fair. But, yeah. Okay.
Well,
we should be done. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Trevor. You're the bomb.
All right. Take care.
Yes. Talk to you later.
Cheers.
Bye.